the promised Esau when Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, finally delivered a healthy son in October 1537. The bells of England rang as though salvation itself had been born. For nearly 3 decades, Henry had pursued one goal above all others: a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. He had broken with Rome, cast aside wives, spilled blood, and risked the very stability of the kingdom in his pursuit of this single obsession. And at last, there in a chamber of Hampton Court Palace, a frail infant wrapped in swaddling cloth seemed to justify it all. Edward Tudor, Prince of Wales, was celebrated as a miracle child. Bonfires were lit in the streets of London, and sermons across the realm proclaimed him as God's divine gift to England. For commoners who had seen monarchs come and go in blood and turmoil, the birth of a son seemed a promise of stability. Yet the joy was laced with grief. 12 days after childbirth, Jane Seymour was dead, taken by postpartum complications. Henry, though shattered, clung fiercely to his son, as though Jane's sacrifice had purchased eternal glory for the Tudors. Edward entered life as a contradiction, cherished beyond measure, yet immediately motherless. His early cradle was not a nursery of warmth and laughter, but a political altar upon which the kingdom placed its hopes. Even before he could walk, Edward was more symbol than child. Nurses whispered of his fragility. He was often sickly, prone to fevers, small for his age yet. Every cough and shiver carried with it the weight of England's destiny. Henry, perhaps softened by guilt or sharpened by desperation, treated the boy with reverence bordering on worship. Unlike his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had felt the whip of his temper and the sting of illegitimacy, Edward knew only praise. His father cradled him in public, called him precious jewel, hand-ordered court artists to immortalize him as England's rising sun. The message was clear. The kingdom had endured years of turmoil. Edward would heal it all. But this adoration came at a price. Edward was never allowed the freedoms of childhood. While peasant children in the villages played games with sticks and hoops, or chased each other in muddy fields, Edward's playtime consisted of ceremonial parades, lessons in deportment, and endless reminders that he was born for divine purpose. Guards shadowed his every movement. Courtiers bowed before him with theatrical reverence. Even his toys were carefully chosen miniature weapons, model churches, gilded Bibles, symbols of what he was meant to become. The child grew up within layers of velvet and iron. Every moment of his existence reinforced the idea that he was not simply Henry's son, but the vessel of God's will on earth. His household staff addressed him as though he were already king. His food was tasted before reaching him, his bed watched over by attendants, and his speech corrected so that even his childish babble carried an air of majesty. Isolation seeped into his bones. Though surrounded by people, he had no playmates, no equals, no chance to learn empathy in the rough and tumble of ordinary childhood. Yet, to the world outside, this isolation looked like glory. Ambassadors wrote letters marveling at the boy's precocity, his solemn demeanor, his angelic looks. Henry staged processions to display his heir, where crowds shouted, "God save the prince," as though he were a saint passing by. But hidden behind the gilded facade was a simple, haunting truth. Edward Seymour Tudor was being raised less as a child and more as a holy instrument object upon which a kingdom's desperate hopes had been carved. This would be the first fracture in the making of the boy king. For in the Tudor world, where power was brittle and enemies waited at every turn, no child could grow naturally under such weight. Edward's mother had died to bring him into being. His father smothered him with unnatural reverence. His court treated him as a prophet. All this love and attention did not nurture him, it trapped him. He learned from the earliest days not to seek companionship, not to play, not to laugh freely. but to carry himself as if the throne already sat beneath him. And perhaps that was the cruelest twist of all. Before Edward could even speak his first words, his destiny had already stolen his childhood. The making of a king had begun. Childhood of a divine H.I.R. Ward's earliest years unfolded in an atmosphere unlike that of any other child in England. To be born royal was already to live apart, but to be born the long-awaited son of Henry VIII was to be placed upon a pedestal so high that ordinary human contact became almost impossible. For Mary and Elizabeth, his elder half-sisters, childhood had been shaped by rejection and uncertainty. Both had been declared illegitimate at different points, their fates shifting with their father's marital whims. They had known insecurity, humiliation, and the sting of Henry's rage. But Edward knew none of that from the very beginning. He was bathed in praise, as though the nation itself knelt before his cradle. Courtiers bowed deeply when he entered a room, treating his every gurgle as a sign of divine blessing. Unlike Mary, who had wept when stripped of her status, or Elizabeth, who had learned early the art of survival through silence and wit, Edward grew up believing that his every word and thought carried divine authority. For a boy not yet able to ride a horse, it was an intoxicating illusion. Henry VIII ensured his son's education would be the finest the kingdom could provide. But this was not merely the education of a noble child. It was a carefully designed program of indoctrination. Cana, Edward was to be the hammer that crushed Catholicism in England, and every lesson was bent toward that purpose. Instead of fairy tales, he heard sermons. Instead of companions, he had tutorsmen, chosen not for gentleness or wisdom, but for their zeal. The court selected a cadre of Protestant intellectuals to mold him. His tutors were not content to teach him Latin declensions or the basics of arithmetic. They fed him radical tracts about the corruption of Rome, the divine right of kings, and the sacred duty of purging heresy. These men believed England was destined to become a new Jerusalem, a purified realm that would set an example for all Christendom. And they impressed upon Edward that he, even as a boy, was chosen to lead this holy mission. John Schick, one of his primary tutors, was both a brilliant classical scholar and a fervent Protestant ideologue. To Schick, Edward was not just a child. He was a vessel for prophecy, the bright flame that would banish the shadows of papal corruption. Every history lesson was framed as a struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. Every story of the ancient world became a parable about kings chosen by God to defend purity. Even Edward's exercises in rhetoric were drilled in the language of condemnation. Catholics were not misguided neighbors, but enemies of Christ deserving eradication. Edward absorbed all of this with the hungry precision of a sharp mind. At the age of 6, while most children were still struggling with penmanship, he could argue coherently about the theological legitimacy of Protestant monarchy. He repeated lessons like holy incantations, that kings ruled not by consent, but by divine right. That mercy toward heretics was weakness, that compromise was betrayal. His tutors applauded his precocity, not realizing not caring that they were nurturing something dangerous. What they did not teach was empathy. What they did not allow was play. Unlike his sisters, who at least knew laughter with companions in their younger years, Edward's world was stripped of ordinary affection. Every word he spoke was measured, every gesture scrutinized. If he smiled, it was to please a tutor. If he frowned, it was to defend doctrine. He was a child raised on abstractions, not affections. There is a tragedy in this kind of isolation. Had Edward been born a baker's son in a London parish, he might have played skittles in the street, teased friends, and learned compassion in shared mischief. Instead, he was told that he was too sacred for such things, that he was not simply Edward, but Edward the Prince, Edward the Protestant hope, Edward the chosen instrument of God. And so, poor Before he had even reached the age of reason, the outlines of his future were set. Edward would not grow into a thoughtful king, tempered by compassion. He would grow into something colder, a boy who saw the world not as a place of people, but as a battlefield of doctrines. A boy who, when the time came, would treat mercy not as virtue, but as sin. In the quiet chambers of Hampton Court in Windsor, the making of a fanatic had already begun. A theological prodigy, or a fanatic in the making. By the time Edward turned 6, his lessons had long outpaced those of any ordinary child. While noble boys across Europe might be learning to ride, to dance, or to manage estates, Edward was immersed in Greek philosophy, Latin oratory, and, most crucially, theology. His tutors, handpicked by Henry VIII, took extraordinary pride in molding him into a prodigy of Protestant thought. Yet what seemed like brilliance to them was, in truth, something far more unsettling. He could already recite complex arguments against papal authority. He could marshal scripture to condemn entire swaths of the population as damned. To Edward, Catholicism was not simply another religion, it was treason against God himself. Each debate, each exercise, reinforced the belief that dissenters did not just disagree. They forfeited their right to exist. This was not education, was weaponization. Central to his instruction was John Schick, the Cambridge-educated tutor whose reputation as a classical scholar was matched only by his religious zeal. Schick and his fellow Protestant reformers saw England as a divine experiment, a nation chosen by God to be purged of corruption and reborn in purity. They impressed upon Edward that he was not merely a boy, but the very instrument of this destiny. Every history lesson became a sermon. Every moral tale a justification for purges yet to come. Schick was joined by figures like Richard Cox and Roger Ascham, men of great learning who nonetheless carried sharp partisan edges. To them, the Catholic Church was not a rival faith, but an agent of the Antichrist. They taught Edward to see compromise as betrayal, moderation as cowardice, and tolerance as weakness. The boy absorbed their lessons with astonishing clarity. He was not content with simple catechism. He demanded to know the philosophical underpinnings of doctrine, the precise scriptural verses that proved the righteousness of his cause. His tutors marveled at his intellect, but what grew quietly alongside it was a chilling detachment from humanity. At the same age when most children are discovering friendship and empathy, Edward was dissecting arguments about eternal damnation. He could converse with university professors about the sacrament of the Eucharist, yet he had never played a game of chase in the courtyard or scraped his knees in a childish fall. His companions were not fellow boys, but stern theologians, each reinforcing the idea that he was God's chosen general in a cosmic war. This imbalance, intellectual sophistication without emotional grounding, was dangerous. It meant Edward learned to view people not as neighbors or subjects, but as vessels of doctrine. A man was not simply Thomas the farmer or John the blacksmith. He was either a true believer or a heretic, and heretics, Edward had already learned, deserved correction by fire or by sword. Even his private writings revealed this early radicalization. Edward's notebooks, preserved in fragments, show a boy fascinated by the architecture of arguments, the neatness of syllogisms, the clarity of theological condemnations. Where another child might sketch horses or castles, Edward annotated passages from reformist tracts, carefully marking which sins deserved the harshest punishments. The joy he found was not in play, but in precision, the precision of judgment, the certainty of authority. Historians often speak of Edward as precocious, but precocity can be a curse when it is bent toward extremism. He was becoming, even before his crown, a creature shaped more by books than by people, more by dogma than by compassion, a boy who could summon the sharpest theological arguments, yet who had never learned to feel the sting of another's tears. It was this chilling combination, brilliant intellect, emotional isolation, and the absolute certainty of divine mission that would soon define his reign. For Edward was not merely learning how to be a Protestant king. He was learning how to be a fanatic cloaked in royal authority. The 9-year-old Jin, January 1547. The bells of Westminster tolled again, not for celebration this time, but for death. Henry VIII, the larger-than-life monarch who had reshaped England's religion and torn his kingdom from Rome, was gone. His body, vast and decayed from years of excess, was lowered into the crypt at Windsor. And in that moment, England passed into the hands of a child. Edward was 9 years old. Too young to shave, too young to command an army, too young even to dress himself without attendants, and yet, by law and by blood, he was now king. The boy who had spent his life being told he was chosen by God suddenly had the chance to wield the authority that matched his indoctrination. The kingdom he inherited was fragile, almost brittle. Henry had left England in religious chaos, monasteries dissolved, the old Catholic faith dismantled, yet the new Protestant church still uncertain in form. Half the country clung to the old ways, lighting candles to saints in secret, whispering Latin prayers at dusk. The other half urged for further reform, demanding the tearing down of every remnant of papal superstition. Beneath this religious divide, famine and poverty gnawed at the people, while noble factions sharpened daggers behind palace doors. In theory, Edward was too young to rule directly. A regency council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, would govern in his name. Two outward eyes, it seemed to safeguard against chaos, seasoned statesmen guiding a frail boy. But behind the closed doors of the council chamber, something astonishing occurred. The boy king did not sit silently. He lectured, interrupted men twice, even 3 times his age. He spoke with the sharp assurance of a child who had never once been contradicted, insisting that policies bend to his doctrinal vision. Imagine the scene: grim-faced nobles in their embroidered robes, debating taxes or military campaigns, when, suddenly, a thin-voiced boy cuts across them, demanding stricter enforcement of Protestant sermons or railing against the errors of papistry. Courtiers were stunned. They had expected a malleable child, someone who could be guided, perhaps manipulated. Instead, they encountered a precocious monarch who believed himself divinely infallible at his coronation. Spectacle only reinforced this illusion. Though too young to carry the orb and scepter for long, Edward sat with solemn majesty, soaking in the chants of Vivat Rex. The crowds cheered a boy they hoped would heal the rift of generations. But Edward, listening to the solemn words of the archbishop, heard only confirmation of what he had always been told, that he was chosen by God to purge England of error. Within weeks of his accession, Edward was reviewing petitions, studying council decrees, and, most chillingly, taking personal interest in cases of treason and heresy. For him, governance was not a burden, but a proving ground, a stage upon which to act out the doctrines that had been drilled into him. Somerset, though initially in control, soon found that the young king was not content to remain a figurehead. Edward pushed boundaries, testing how far his word could bend the machinery of state. Where another child might have hesitated, Edward demanded. And where another council might have curbed him, his advisors by his precocity, and fearful of denying a monarch allowed him space. In that permission, the first seeds of tyranny began to take root. The 9-year-old king, molded in scripture and certainty, was no longer merely a prodigy of theology. He was now a ruler, with the weight of the crown upon his head and the full power of the English throne beneath his hand. And he meant to use it not cautiously, not mercifully, but with the conviction of one who believed compromise itself was sin. The king's hands on the levers of Pal Wy, though Edward's youth made it impossible for him to rule without regents. He quickly learned how to project authority over men decades his senior, where other child kings in history had been little more than ornamental puppets wielded by ambitious advisors. Edward was different. He had been raised not to obey, but to command. And so, even at 10 years old, he began bending the regency to his will. His uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, styled himself Lord Protector of the realm and assumed near monarchical authority. He presented himself as both guardian and guide for the young king, determined to advance Protestant reform. But Somerset soon discovered that his ward was not content to simply observe. Edward took an obsessive interest in government papers, personally annotating documents and commenting on policy. His neat handwriting appears in the margins of council notes, sharp, decisive, and patient. He did not merely accept reports, he judged them, often with the same merciless logic his tutors had instilled in him. For the boy king, governance was a continuation of his theological lessons. Somerset might think in terms of diplomacy, finance, or the delicate balance of noble factions. Edward thought in terms of purity and corruption, truth and heresy, where Somerset hesitated, aware that too much reform might spark rebellion. Edward urged speed. The realm must be cleansed, he insisted. Delay was not caution, but betrayal. Somerset's policies reflected this zeal. Images of saints were torn from churches, Latin Mass was banned, priests were ordered to preach sermons denouncing papal authority. And yet, even these sweeping changes did not satisfy Edward's hunger for reform. He wanted harsher measures, firmer punishments, and absolute eradication of popish idolatry. In his mind, compromise was not statesmanship, but sin. But religious zeal was only one part of Edward's engagement with power. The boy revealed an unnerving fascination with control itself, especially over matters of punishment and justice, where most children of his age might recoil from talk of executions. Edward demanded to be kept informed. Reports of heretics burned at the stake, traitors hanged, or rebels crushed were read to him in detail. He listened intently, not with horror, but with curiosity and even approval. One striking example survives in his private journal. Edward recorded, in cold, factual language, the execution of his own uncle, Thomas Seymour Somerset's brother, who had been accused of treason. The Lord Sudeley, Admiral of England, was condemned to death and died the 20th of March. No emotion, no grief, only the precision of a clerk tallying numbers. A boy of 12, writing with the detachment of a bureaucrat of blood. This was not indifference born of immaturity. It was the product of his indoctrination. Edward believed he ruled by divine mandate, and therefore told those who opposed him, or even threatened stability, were enemies of God. To feel pity for them would have been, in his mind, to betray heaven's will. Even his counselors noticed the iron streak in their king. Ambassadors reported that Edward, though small in stature and often frail in health, spoke with such composure and severity that grown men hesitated before contradicting him. He was not boisterous like his father, nor cunningly playful like his sister Elizabeth. He was something more unnerving, a child who believed every word he spoke carried divine weight, and so the paradox deepened. England was governed by men of ambition and rivalry. Somerset, Dudley, and others, but behind them, in the royal apartments, a boy king was watching, learning, and pressing for ever harsher reforms. He was both pawn and player, both child and tyrant. His hands were not yet fully on the levers of power, but he was reaching, grasping, pulling them closer every day. The kingdom under a child's fist is the first years of Edward's reign unfolded. It became clear that the kingdom was not ruled by gentle compromise, but by a tightening grip. Somerset, then John Dudley, later Duke of Northumberland, held the official reins of power, But Edward's presence loomed over every decision. The regents claimed authority in his name. Yet Edward himself was shaping the moral and religious agenda, urging them ever further down the path of reform and repression. For ordinary people, the consequences were stark. The changes ordered in London reached into every parish, every village, every household. Images of saints were smashed, crucifixes torn down, wall paintings whitewashed. The English countryside, once rich with the color and pageantry of Catholic devotion, was stripped bare. Where once villagers had gathered for processions, feast days, and rituals, now they were ordered to attend austere Protestant sermons delivered from pulpits barren of decoration. To Edward, this was progressed the triumph of truth over superstition. To many of his subjects, it was devastation. These traditions had been the fabric of their lives for generations, binding families, communities, and even the rhythm of the seasons together. To see them outlawed, mocked, and punished was more than disorienting. It was enraging. That rage soon erupted. In 1549, rebellion flared across the kingdom. The Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall saw thousands rise in defense of the old Latin Mass. In Norfolk, Robert Cat led an army of discontented peasants, furious not only at religious reforms, but also at the harsh economic realities and closure of lands, rising rents, and famine. For Edward, these uprisings were not the cries of desperate men and women, but proof of wickedness. He demanded they be crushed, and crushed they were. Somerset's forces marched, fought, and slaughtered. Thousands of rebels were executed, hanged from trees, or left to rot as warnings. The boy king recorded these events in his journal with chilling detachment. The rebellion was ended. Many were slain. Not a word of pity, not a flicker of empathy, only the cold arithmetic of order restored. The rebellions weakened Somerset, exposing his failure to maintain stability. By 1550, Dudley had maneuvered him out of power and assumed control of the council. Where Somerset had been reformist and idealistic, Dudley was pragmatic and ruthless. Yet even he recognized that Edward was no passive figurehead. The boy had a will of steel, and Dudley understood that to keep power, he had to align himself with the king's fervent Protestantism. Edward, now entering his teens, grew bolder. He drafted detailed notes on church governance, proposed new laws, and even sketched his own blueprint for the kingdom's spiritual future. He saw himself not merely as monarch, but as reformer-in-chief, a prophet crowned with earthly power. He spoke often of the need to purify England, to make it a shining example to the world and nation without the stain of popish idolatry. But with each demand for purity came harsher punishments. Priests who clung to the old ways were imprisoned. Lay people who resisted the new prayer book risked charges of sedition. Mercy was not an option. Leniency was betrayal. In Edward's eyes, he was not presiding over cruelty. He was presiding over salvation. To him, each death was a necessary pruning of the kingdom's soul. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his reign. Edward did not revel in blood like his father, nor in spectacle like some of his contemporaries. His fanaticism was colder, more clinical. He justified executions, not with passion, but with logic. A man burned at the stake was not a tragedy, but an equation solved, heresy confronted, error corrected, God's will done. And so, under the reign of a boy, England bled. Not in the grand wars of conquest Henry had dreamed of, but in the steady, merciless enforcement of religious uniformity. A child, raised without play or pity, now sat in judgment over the souls of millions. The prodigy's vision of a new Jerusalem by 1552. Edward was 14 years old, still frail of body, but formidable in mind. The more he grew, the more his sense of divine mission crystallized. Unlike his father, who who had pursued reform to serve his dynastic power and appetites. Edward believed reform was an end in itself. His crown was not a tool of statecraft, but a sword of God. He spent hours in study, poring over scripture, law, and the writings of continental reformers. His private notes show a chilling obsession: lists of sins and their punishments, proposals for harsher enforcement against idolaters, and outlines of a kingdom where the last traces of Catholicism were eradicated. He dreamed of an England so purified that it would stand as the New Jerusalem, a beacon to the Protestant world. Unlike most monarchs, Edouard was not distracted by hunting, jousting, or courtly love. His pleasures were intellectual, his ambitions theological. In his mind, to reform England was to reform the world, and he believed himself uniquely chosen for the task. Even the older, seasoned Dudley, now effectively ruling as Duke of Northumberland, could not entirely control the boy king's fervor. Edward would not allow himself to be merely managed. He demanded to shape policy, and Dudley, fearing the boy's wrath, gave him room. It was during these years that Edward began to envision what might be called a blueprint for theocratic monarchy, spoke and wrote of rooting out sin, not just in churches, but in daily life. He supported laws against gambling, swearing, and idleness. He advocated for moral surveillance, where subjects lived under constant watch to ensure their conformity. To Edward, such measures were not tyranny but charity, saving souls from damnation by force. If necessary, this terrifying clarity is captured in his writings. When he described the burning of heretics, his tone was not vengeful but almost serene. He wrote of justice, of order, of God's will fulfilled. In his logic, to permit heresy was to condemn souls to hell. Therefore, to execute a heretic was an act of mercy upon the nation. His cruelty was not wild or erratic, was systematic. Observers at court began to notice the boy's unflinching severity. Foreign ambassadors, writing back to their masters, remarked with awe and unease that England's young king spoke with a conviction far beyond his years. He seemed utterly convinced of his infallibility, a child with the certainty of a prophet. Even his half-sister, Elizabeth, sharp and cautious, recognized the steel in him, while Mary, the Catholic heir, understood that if Edward lived long enough, she might never ascend the throne at all. But Edward's body was failing, even as his mind soared. His lifelong frailty began to show signs of something darker: a racking cough, great night sweats, weight that melted away despite careful diets and physicians' potions. His tutors and ministers pressed him to rest, but Edward refused to yield. He wrote, he planned, he ruled with the ferocity of someone who sensed his time was short, and, indeed, he was right. The boy who dreamed of purging England to its roots would soon find himself in a battle, not with papists or rebels, but with death itself. A dying king's last crusade. By early 1553, Edward's health had collapsed. The coughing fits that once rattled his slender frame became torrents of blood. His skin turned waxen, his eyes sunken, his body wasted too little more than bones. Court physicians whispered the word they dared not speak aloud: consumption tuberculosis. In a matter of months, the boy who had been groomed as God's chosen instrument looked more like a corpse than a king. Yet, even as death gripped him, Edward's mind burned hotter than ever. He had no intention of letting his grand project, the creation of a purified Protestant kingdom, die with him. And so, at 15 years old, he set himself to his final, most chilling task: the rewriting of England's future, the law of succession. Enshrined by his father, Henry VIII, was clear. If Edward died childless, the crown would pass first to his half-sister, Mary, a devout Catholic, and then to Elizabeth, a Protestant of cautious leanings. But Edward recoiled at this prospect. To him, Mary was not merely a sibling, but a threat to everything he had built. She inherited the throne, the kingdom would be dragged back to papal darkness. All the sermons, the reforms, the executions, everything would be undone. And so the boy king, coughing blood into his handkerchief, took pen in hand and devised what he called his devise for the succession. In it, he bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth, declaring them illegitimate, and named instead his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as heir. Jane was young, pious, and deeply Protestant, the perfect vessel for Edward's vision. This was no idle fantasy. Edward personally revised the document multiple times, adjusting wording, sharpening its legal authority. In the margins of drafts, his spidery handwriting survives, making clear that this was not Dudley's scheme alone, but Edward's own deliberate design. Even on his deathbed, the boy was legislating the kingdom's future, attempting to bind England to his will. The court fractured around him. Some counselors feared the plan was unlawful, a dangerous gamble that would plunge the nation into civil war. But Edward would not relent. Summoning what little strength remained, he argued, pleaded, commanded, his voice hoarse, his lungs drowning, yet his will unbroken. To him, this was not politics, but salvation. Mary on the throne meant damnation for England. Jane meant redemption. By June, Edward was too weak to rise from bed. He wasted away in his chambers at Greenwich, surrounded by physicians, attendants, and the stifling smell of sickness. Still, he demanded sermons be read to him, still clung to his prayer book, still dictated matters of faith and law. He was, to the end, the king who never doubted himself. On July 6, 1553, as the summer heat pressed heavy over London, Edward VI exhaled his last. He was 15 years old. In the official accounts, he died with the most godly prayer upon his lips. In truth, he died a boy who had been denied childhood, shaped into a weapon, and used himself as one until his body gave out. But even in death, his shadow lingered. For 9 days, Lady Jane Grey would sit upon the throne, the child queen of Edward's design. And though she would soon fall, and Mary would rise in fire and vengeance, the imprint of Edward's brief reign remained, a vision of rule without mercy, of faith without compromise, of a boy who believed himself chosen to purify a kingdom even if it bled. The legacy of the boy Keonji Edward Vye's reign lasted barely 6.5 years. Yet its shadow stretched far beyond his death. He left no victories carved on stone monuments, no sprawling palaces of his own design, no heirs to carry his bloodline. What he left instead was something more intangible and far more unsettling. He left an idea. Edward's England was the first experiment in making Protestantism not merely the preference of the monarch, but the mandatory creed of an entire nation. His counselors had enforced reforms before him, but Edward's personal zeal made those reforms sharper, harsher, and uncompromising. Under his watch, the English Reformation became not a negotiation, but a crusade. The boy king's writings reveal that he had no concept of tolerance, no sense of compromise, no patience for difference. For Edward, religion was not a spectrum, but a battlefield, and he was commander-in-chief. To him, every Catholic was a traitor, every heretic an enemy, every dissent an offense, not just against crown, but against God himself. That vision, clinical, absolutist, merciless, would echo long after his frail body was gone. His death opened the door to chaos. Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign collapsed in blood, and Mary ascended the throne, bringing with her a Catholic revival so fierce that it seared itself into English memory as the Marian burnings. Yet, in a sense, Mary's brutality was the mirror image of Edward's, 2 children of Henry VIII, both fanatics in their own way, convinced that only their faith could save England. And then came Elizabeth, who would reign for decades. Unlike Edward, she learned the art of balance, outwardly Protestant, but cautious. pragmatic, willing to tolerate gray where her brother had demanded only black and white. Yet, even she could never entirely erase the stamp Edward had left. The Church of England would remain Protestant at its core, its Catholic past stripped away by the reforms Edward had pushed forward with such severity. Historians still argue, was Edward a pawn of his regents, or a prodigy who ruled in his own right? The evidence, his journal, his annotations, his reforms suggests the latter. He was not a mere boy being manipulated. He was a boy manipulating others, bending older and more experienced men to enact his uncompromising vision. And so, the legacy of Edward VI is not measured in years, but in intensity. He was England's only true child, king, and, yet, in mind and in conviction, he was perhaps the least childlike ruler the Tudors ever produced. Where Henry VIII left a kingdom drenched in blood, Edward left one drenched in doctrine. Where his sisters would bend and sway with circumstance, Edward never bent at all. He remains, even now, a figure both tragic and terrifying. A boy denied the softness of childhood, raised to believe himself God's instrument, and who embraced that destiny with chilling devotion. At 15, he lay in his deathbed, his lungs collapsing, yet still drafting laws to shape a future he would never see. That is Edward's legacy, not just that he died young, but that he ruled young, with a will as sharp as any blade his father ever wielded. The prodigy king, the godly tyrant, the child who would not play.